The blood-soaked Navy SEAL commander had been unconscious for 11 hours when his eyes snapped open at 3:17 in the morning. No confusion, no disorientation. Just locked eye contact with the nurse checking his IV line, and then his right hand lifted, trembling, and formed a salute. The nurse's entire body went rigid. "Lieutenant Commander," he rasped. "I thought you were dead." She wasn't supposed to react, wasn't supposed to recognize that name, wasn't supposed to be anything other than a mid-level floor nurse who'd been shuffled off to supply duty 3 days ago. But her hands had already stopped moving, because the man in that bed was one of only 4 people on Earth who knew the truth about who she actually was. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the stories that keep you up at night, live. We bring you cinematic, edge-of-your-seat drama every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Smash that like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story has already traveled. Now let's go back to that hospital room, because nothing about this night is going to go the way anyone expects. The supply closet on the 3rd floor of Hargrove Memorial Hospital smelled like floor wax and expired antiseptic, and Nora Whitaker had memorized every shelf in it over the past 72 hours. Gauze pads, lower left, tubing, upper right. Saline bags, middle rack, organized by volume, because she'd had nothing else to do with her hands since Dr. Gerald Voss had reassigned her there with a memo so short it was almost insulting. Nurse Whitaker effective immediately. Supply inventory and restocking. 3rd floor until further notice, no explanation, no meeting. Just a printed sheet slipped under the break room door at 6 in the morning. She'd crumpled it, then smoothed it back out, then folded it into her scrub pocket because destroying it felt too much like the kind of dramatic reaction that would prove their point about her. That she didn't belong, that she was a problem, that whoever had hired her had made a mistake they were quietly correcting. She was 38 years old, and she'd spent the last 4 years building Nora Whitaker from the ground up, the nursing degree, the transfer records, the vague but functional employment history that would survive a basic background check. She was good at her job. She was careful, kept her head down and her assessments sharp, and she had never for 4 years given anyone a real reason to look at her twice. Then she'd corrected the wrong doctor in front of the wrong audience, and here she was, counting gauze pads at 2 a.m. It had happened 6 days ago in Trauma Bay 2, during what should have been a contained hemorrhagic situation. The patient was a 53-year-old construction foreman named Dale Briggs, 230 pounds, blunt abdominal trauma from a crane collapse, pressure dropping faster than the team was reacting to. Dr. Gerald Voss, chief of surgery, 14 years at Hargrove, the kind of man whose reputation had calcified into something. He wore like body armor, had called for a specific dosage adjustment that Nora had recognized instantly as wrong. Not slightly wrong, dangerously wrong. The kind of wrong that would send Briggs into irreversible shock within 4 minutes. She'd said so, quietly, directly, with the specific clinical reasoning laid out in 2 sentences because that's all there was time for. Voss had looked at her, the way people look at something they've tracked in on their shoe. "I don't believe I was asking for your input." Nurse, he'd paused, couldn't immediately recall her name. 70 milligrams at his current pressure will tank his MAP below 50, she'd said. He's already compensating. You need to cut the dose and get vascular on the phone. Get her out of my trauma bay, Voss had said, not even looking at her anymore, already moving. And then Dale Briggs's pressure had crashed, exactly the way she'd said it would, and the team had scrambled, and in the chaos someone had quietly made the correction she'd suggested, and Dale Briggs had survived. And Voss had never once acknowledged what had happened. 3 days later, the memo, she hadn't fought it, hadn't gone to HR. Hadn't called a lawyer or cried in the bathroom or posted anything to anyone. She'd taken hers to the supply closet and she'd started counting gauze pads because that was the kind of thing Nora Whitaker did. Nora Whitaker was patient. Nora Whitaker waited. Nora Whitaker had learned a long time ago that the people who underestimated you were only ever doing you a favor. The call came over the intercom at 2:43 a. Not a standard trauma alert. A different code one she almost didn't recognize, because she hadn't heard it used in a civilian hospital before. Code Obsidian. Military priority patient incoming. Restricted access. Floor lockdown pending. All non-essential personnel to clear the 3rd floor corridor immediately. She set in town her clipboard. The 3rd floor was her floor. She stepped out of the supply closet into a hallway that was already filling with a specific kind of controlled tension sissons. Moving faster than usual, a security guard she didn't recognize appearing at the stairwell door. and 2 men in civilian clothes who were very clearly not civilian, standing near the elevator bay with the particular stillness of people trained to watch everything at once. A gurney came off the elevator at speed. The patient was male, large, deep lacerations across the left side of his face, one arm immobilized, chest wrapped with field dressings that had soaked through twice, an oxygen mask, 2 military-grade vials already running, and 4 men around the gurney who moved like a single organism, precise and coordinated, with the specific efficiency of people who'd transported casualties under fire. Nora stood against the wall, watched. The patient's face was turned toward her for exactly 2 seconds as the gurney passed. Her stomach dropped through the floor. She knew that face. Not from television, not from a file, not from a photograph. She knew it the way you know the faces of people you've watched bleed in the dark, people you've kept alive with your bare hands when there was nothing else left to use. She knew the particular set of his jaw and the scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his eye, a scar she had personally cleaned and closed 7 years ago in a field position that officially didn't exist. His name was Commander Dax Merritt, and the last time she'd seen him, she'd been ordering him to run. She did not follow the gurney. She went back into the supply closet, stood very still in the dark for 6 seconds, and talked herself through it the way she'd learned to talk herself through things that threatened to break her composure. He probably wouldn't make it to consciousness tonight. His injuries were severe. She'd cataloged them in the 2 seconds she'd had, the way she'd been trained to catalog everything, automatically, without effort, the same way other people noticed the weather. And if he did wake up, it didn't mean he'd recognize her. It had been 7 years. She looked different. Different hair, different weight, no uniform. People saw what they expected to see. She went back to counting gauze pads. Counted them twice, at 3:17 a. The call light from room 312, the restricted room, the room they'd locked from the outside with a key card she didn't have access to, began flashing on the nursing station panel. The nurse assigned to that room, a second-year named Petra, was on break. The charge nurse was handling a situation in 308, and the 2 men in civilian clothes who'd been standing near the elevator were both currently in the stairwell with one of the military escorts, discussing something in low, tense voices. The light kept flashing. Nora was not assigned to room 312. She had no authorization to enter room 312. She was technically assigned to a supply closet. She walked to the nursing station, picked up the key card that Petra had left beside her workstation, because Petra was 26 and hadn't yet learned to treat every protocol like it might save someone's life, and she walked to room 312, and she opened the door. Dax Merritt's eyes were open, not glassy, not confused. Not the slow surfacing look of someone coming up from heavy sedation. Fully open, tracking-oriented. His right hand came up before she was fully through the doorway, and he formed the salute with the arm that wasn't immobilized, and his voice was raw from the intubation tube, but absolutely clear. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, "I thought you were dead." She moved to the bedside, checked his IV lines, checked his oxygen saturation, did not look directly at his face. "You're in a civilian hospital," she said quietly. "You were injured. You're stable, Evelyn." Not a question, not confused, a statement. "My name is Nora Whitaker," she said. "I'm a nurse at this hospital. You've been sedated, and you may be experiencing some... I know what I'm looking at." His voice dropped further. "I've been looking for you for 3 years. The people who sent me looking, they're not the kind of people you want finding you first." She finally met his eyes. He looked older. The scar was heavier. There was something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before, not trauma exactly, but the particular weight of a man who'd been carrying something too long without putting it down. "You need to rest," she said. "You need to listen," he said, "because what I was running, when they hit us, it's still running. And part of it is running here." The door opened before she could respond. The man who came through wasn't one of the military escorts. She'd already cataloged those 4, their builds, their stances, the way they wore their sidearms. This was someone different. Civilian suit, federal badge on his hip, and the specific look of a person who'd been woken up in the middle of the night and was processing it as professionally as possible, but not quite getting there. "Nurse," he looked at her badge, "Whitaker, you're not cleared for this room." "Patient's call light was active," she said. "I was the available staff. I'll need your employee ID and your shift supervisor's name." "Of course." She set down the IV tubing she'd been checking. "He's showing good orientation, pupils equal and reactive. Pain response appropriate. You should know he was lucid enough to speak." The federal agent no-name badge, which told her something, looked at Merritt, who had closed his eyes again with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to appear unconscious when it was useful. What did he say? He asked where he was, she said. Told him. He went back under. The agent studied her for 3 seconds. She held his gaze without blinking, without shifting her weight, with exactly the amount of mild professional attention that Nora Whitaker, supply closet nurse, nobody in particular would direct at a federal officer at 3A. Get your supervisor to log this entry, he said, and don't come back to this room without explicit authorization. Understood, she said. She left. She did not look back at the bed. In the hallway, she kept her pace even, her shoulders level, her face neutral, and she walked back to the supply closet and sat down on a box of saline bags in the dark and stayed there for a very long time. By 6 in the morning, the hospital had a different energy. She felt it before she understood it, a subtle tightening in the air. The way people moved slightly faster or slightly more carefully. The way conversations dropped when she came near. She'd spent enough time in environments where information was dangerous to recognize the texture of institutional anxiety. She found out what was driving it when she passed the nursing station and caught a fragment of conversation between 2 residents. 3 patients, same ward, same week. Nobody's talking about the talk screens. Voss signed off on all 3. Voss signs off on everything. She didn't slow down, didn't look at them, kept walking. But she filed it. The man who found her at 7:15 was not someone she'd seen before. Mid-30s, resident's coat, the specific exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept in 36 hours, but was running on something sharper than caffeine. He came around the corner near the supply closet with the look of a person who'd been looking for her specifically. Nora Whitaker, he said. Yes. I'm Ethan Cole, resident internal medicine. He lowered his voice. I heard you got reassigned down here after the Vasa situation. Word travels, she said. In this hospital it does. He glanced both ways down the hallway. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. The patient in 312, the military transfer. Do you know anything about why he was moved here specifically? Not just to a civilian facility. Here, this hospital. She looked at him. Why would you think I'd know that? Because you went into that room at 3 in the morning with a key card you authorized to use, and you came out looking like someone who'd just seen something they'd spent years not seeing. He said it without accusation. Just observation. Like someone who'd gotten very good at reading rooms. And because I've spent the last 6 days looking at 3 patient charts that don't make any sense, and the only thing connecting those patients to each other, aside from doctor, Voss, is that they were all prior military. She studied him. He was either exactly what he appeared to be, a young doctor with too much integrity and not enough self-preservation instinct, or he was something else entirely sent to test her. She'd been in enough situations to know how to tell the difference, usually. What's wrong with the chart? She said. He exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath since he'd found her. The treatment protocols, he said, they're not matched to the diagnoses. The medications that were ordered, some of them, I can't find in any standard formulary. And the dosages are, he stopped. 2 of those patients died within 48 hours of admission. The 3rd is gone. Transfer paperwork says he was moved to another facility, but I called the facility and they have no record of him. The supply closet hallway felt very small. Have you reported this? She asked. To Voss is chief of surgery. The attending of record for all 3 cases is Dr. Lena Hart, who has been mysteriously unavailable since Tuesday. He ran a hand through his hair. I've been trying to pull the files for 4 days, and every time I get close, the system logs me out, or the hard copies are checked out to Voss's office. Stop trying to pull the files through the system, she said. What if someone is watching for access attempts? You're flagging yourself every time you log in. She kept her voice flat. Clinical, do you have anything physical? Anything you printed before they started monitoring? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded set of papers printed in small font, 2-sided, crumpled from being shoved somewhere fast. She took them without reaching for them, obviously, opened them with her back to the hallway camera. She read for 30 seconds. Her jaw tightened once. She controlled it. Okay, she said. Okay, what? You're right that something is wrong. She folded the papers and handed them back. And, okay, you need to be more careful than you've been. If you're right about this, and someone at this hospital is connected to it, you've already made yourself visible. I know, he didn't look away. That's why I found you. Why me? Because you went into that room, he said. And because the patient, whatever he said to you, you walked out of there differently than you walked in. A pause. I don't know who you are, but I don't think you're just a nurse. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm exactly a nurse, she said. Go do your rounds. Don't access any more restricted files. And don't talk to Voss about any of this. She went back into the supply closet. She stood in the dark and thought about Dax Merritt lying in that bed saying it's still running, and part of it is running here. She thought about 3 military patients with impossible chart discrepancies. She thought about the federal agent who'd appeared too fast, known her name too easily, and not shown his own credentials long enough for her to read the issuing agency on the badge. She thought about the 7 years she'd spent building a life small enough to stay invisible, and she thought, it found me anyway. She was restocking IV tubing at 9 a.m. when Dr. Gerald Voss appeared in the supply closet doorway. He didn't knock. He filled the frame the way powerful men fill spaces, with the implicit assumption that the space was already his. Whitaker, he said, Dr. Voss. She didn't turn around immediately. Finished placing the tubing on the shelf, then turned. Is there something you need? I heard you entered the restricted room on 3rd floor last night. No preamble. No pretense of small talk. The call light was active, she said. The assigned nurse was on break. I checked on the patient and reported to the attending federal contact. You don't have clearance for that patient. The patient was alone and agitated, she said. I made a nursing judgment. Voss stepped into the closet. He was 60, silver-haired, broad, and he'd spent decades learning how to use his physical presence as a professional instrument. He stopped close enough that it was deliberate. Let me be clear about something, he said. Your position here is already provisional. What happened in Trauma 2 was unacceptable. You undermined a senior physician in front of his team. You disrupted a procedure. And you were fortunate that my recommendation to HR was reassignment rather than termination. A pause. That recommendation can be revised. She held his gaze. The patient survived. The patient survived because of my team, he said flatly. What you did was interference, and what you did last night in 312 was interference. He let that sit. I'm going to recommend to administration that your position here be reviewed. Formally. That's your right, she said. He waited for something more. Some crack in her composure. Some sign of the fear he was looking for. She gave him nothing. His jaw shifted slightly. Clear this closet by end of shift, he said. You'll be notified about the review. He left. She waited until his footsteps faded, then pressed her back against the shelf and stared at the ceiling and breathed very steadily for 30 seconds. She was running out of time. She'd known that from the moment she'd seen Dax Merritt's face on that gurney. The question was what she was going to do about it, because she'd spent 7 years choosing to do nothing. Choosing survival over justice, choosing invisibility over the truth that she'd been carrying like shrapnel in her chest since the night her team died in a valley that no one was ever supposed to know existed. And now Commander Dax Merritt was lying 40 feet away with whatever he'd carried here from that same darkness. And somewhere in this hospital, 3 military patients had died in ways that didn't make any sense. And a young resident with no instinct for self-preservation had handed her a set of papers that confirmed what Merritt had started saying before she'd stopped him. Part of it is running here. She picked up her clipboard. She went back to counting, but she wasn't counting gauze anymore. She was counting how many ways this could go wrong, and how many of them she could survive, and whether surviving was still the thing she was actually trying to do, or whether, after 7 years, she was finally, quietly, ready to stop running and start reckoning. At 11:47 a.m., the call light from room 312 began flashing again. This time, the federal agent who'd warned her away was nowhere on the floor. This time, Dax Merritt was not pretending to be unconscious. This time, when she opened the door, he was sitting up in the bed with his one functional hand wrapped around the wrist of a man in scrubs, who was not a doctor, not a nurse, and not any kind of hospital staff she'd ever seen, holding a syringe that was already half depressed with something that was not in any patient's chart. Merritt's eyes locked onto hers. Lock the door, he said. She locked the door. The man in scrubs stopped struggling the moment he heard the deadbolt engage, not because he'd given up, but because he was recalculating. Nora could see it happening behind his eyes. The shift from physical resistance to something colder, something that was already measuring the room, measuring her, measuring the distance to the window. She'd seen that look before, not in hospitals. Put it down, she said. He didn't. The syringe was still in his hand, the plunger still partially depressed, the contents, whatever they were, still mostly present. Merritt's grip on his wrist hadn't loosened. Merritt was also working with one functional arm, a chest full of bruised ribs, and a blood pressure that had no business supporting this kind of exertion, but his hand was locked around that wrist like a bracket welded to steel. You're a nurse? The man in scrubs said to her. His voice was controlled, almost reasonable. You don't want to be involved in this. You're in a patient's room with an unlabeled syringe, she said. I'm already involved. She crossed the room in 4 steps, took his wrist above Merritt's grip with her left hand, and rotated not violently, not dramatically, just with precise mechanical understanding of where a joint would rather not go, and the syringe came free. She capped it one-handed against her thigh. The way she'd learned to do things one-handed, when the other hand was busy keeping pressure on a wound, set it on the bedside table and stepped back. The man looked at her with an expression that was no longer calculating. It was something else, recognition, almost, like he was updating a file. "Get out," Merritt said. The man in scrubs straightened his collar, looked at the door, looked at Nora, looked at the syringe on the table. "Your access badge," she said. He stared at her. "Give me your access badge," she said, "or I call the nursing station and report a security breach in a restricted patient room. Either way, you're not leaving this floor with that badge." He unclipped it from his scrub pocket and set it on the tray table beside the syringe. His face was professionally blank now, which was its own kind of answer, the face of someone who'd been trained to give nothing away when things went sideways. He left. She heard his footsteps go quickly down the hallway, not running, just fast. She stood there, back to the closed door, and looked at Dax Merritt and said nothing for a moment. "You should be lying down," she finally said.
"Yeah."
He sank back against the pillow, and for the first time she could see how much that had cost him, the color draining from around his mouth, the controlled way he was breathing through what was probably significant pain. Probably. She picked up the syringe with a gloved hand, read nothing on the label because there was no label, and wrapped it in a glove and put it in her scrub pocket where it would stay until she figured out what to do with it. Then she checked his IV lines, checked his blood pressure on the monitor high, but not crisis level, and pulled the blanket back where it had slipped. "How did he get in?" she asked. "Keycard, same as yours," a pause. "Except mine was the real one." She understood what he was saying. Whoever had given that man access to this room had done it through official channels, which meant whoever had sent him had reach inside the hospital's security infrastructure. "You said something last night," she said, "that it was still running. That part of it was here. I know what I said. Tell me the rest of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, morning light was doing something gray and indifferent over the parking structure, and the monitor beeped steadily, and somewhere down the hall a cart rattled past. Normal sounds. Hospital sounds. The sounds of a place that was supposed to be about repair, and instead was doing something else entirely, apparently. "How much do you actually want to know?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a real question from someone who understood that information had weight, and once you were carrying it, you couldn't put it back down. "All of it," she said. He talked for 20 minutes, stopping twice when the pain in his side made his jaw tighten and his words go short. She let him stop. She didn't rush him. 7 years ago, the unit Nora Evelyn had commanded was running a medical support operation embedded with a special reconnaissance team in a region that she was not going to name and that Merritt referred to only as the Valley. The mission parameters were straightforward: medical oversight, extraction support, document anything they found at a secondary site that turned out to be a field testing installation for a weapons program that had no official designation and no official existence. They found the installation, they documented it, and within 6 hours of the documentation being transmitted back through the chain, they walked into an ambush that was too coordinated, too perfectly positioned, to be anything other than deliberate. Someone in their own command structure had received their transmission and used it to vector in a kill team. She knew all of this. She'd been there. She'd made the call to hold the rear position while Merritt took the survivors out. And then she'd spent 4 days getting herself out of the valley, through channels that didn't exist either. And then she'd spent 6 months building Nora Whitaker out of borrowed credentials and careful silence. What she didn't know was what had happened after. The weapons program didn't stop, Merritt said. It went quiet, moved laterally, changed contractors, changed funding channels, changed what they were calling it on paper. But the core of it, the research, the testing, it kept going. He shifted slightly and stopped, waited for something to pass. 18 months ago, I started picking up indicators, data points. Nothing direct, nothing I could bring to anyone officially, because I still don't know how deep the compromise goes in the command structure. But the pattern was consistent. Whatever they were testing in the valley, they eventually moved to a second phase. Human trials. She said distributed, nothing centralized enough to raid. Hospitals, mostly. Civilian facilities with military patient populations where you can access wounded veterans without triggering the kind of scrutiny you'd get on a base. He met her eyes. This hospital has 3 documented deaths in the past 14 days that match the clinical signature I've been tracking. Prior military, admitted for unrelated conditions, died within 48 hours of receiving treatments that aren't in any standard protocol. Ethan Cole's papers, the impossible chart discrepancies. The medication she couldn't find in any formulary. The resident knows, she said. He came to me this morning. Merritt's expression shifted. How much does he know? Enough to have made himself a target if someone's watching the file access logs. She thought about Ethan's face in the hallway. The way he'd said, I don't know who you are, but I don't think you're just a nurse. He's smart, but he doesn't know what he's walking into. Nobody does until it's too late, Merritt said. That's the design. She stood up from the chair beside his bed and walked to the window. The parking structure was filling up with morning arrivals. Normal people coming in for normal reasons, visiting family routine procedures, the 1,000 ordinary crises of ordinary lives that a hospital was supposed to handle. The man who just tried to inject you, she said. What was in the syringe? I don't know exactly, but I've seen the effects before. In the charts, he paused. It wouldn't have looked like murder. It would have looked like a complication. She turned around. Who sent him? That's the question I came here to answer. His voice was tired. Not defeated, just tired in the way of someone who'd been running the same calculation for a long time and was still looking for the variable that resolved it. I came here because the data pointed here, and because I needed someone I could trust. You don't know if you can trust me, she said. You haven't seen me in 7 years. I know what you did in that valley, he said. I know you held that position alone for 4 hours. I know what it cost to make that call. He looked at the ceiling. If you'd wanted to stay disappeared, you'd have walked past my room last night. You didn't. She had nothing useful to say to that, so she said nothing. The federal contact they assigned to this room, she said after a moment. Who does he work for? He told me DIA Defense Intelligence Agency. A pause. I don't think that's true. Why? Because when I was transported here, I was told specifically that no federal agencies had been notified of my location. Operational security. And then he appeared within 2 hours of my arrival. Merritt's jaw was tight. Someone told him where I was, which means either the people running this program have contacts inside DA, or he's not DA at all. Nora stood with her hand, resting on the window ledge, and thought about the badge she hadn't been able to read fast enough. Thought about how quickly he'd appeared after she'd left the room, how precisely he'd known her name. His name, she said. Did he give you a name, Garrison? Merritt said. Agent Garrison. She found Ethan Cole at 12:30 in the hospital cafeteria, eating a sandwich he was barely tasting, staring at his phone with the expression of someone looking at information they wish they hadn't found. She sat across from him without announcing herself, and he startled badly enough that he knocked his coffee. Don't do that, he said. You need to stop accessing the files, she said. Completely log out of everything and don't go back in. He was already mopping coffee off the table with a napkin. I found something else. I know you need to stop. There's a 4th patient. He lowered his voice. The cafeteria was half full, the ambient noise enough to cover a quiet conversation, but he was hunched forward anyway. Male 61, prior Army, admitted last week for what the chart says was a cardiac event. He's still here, room 218, and his treatment record has the same anomalies as the others. Her stomach tightened. He's still alive? As of an hour ago, yes. Ethan crumpled the napkin. But they've got him scheduled for what the chart calls a protocol adjustment at 3 this afternoon, and whatever the others got during their protocol adjustments. I know what happened to the others, she said. He stopped. Looked at her. How the patient 312, she said. He's been tracking this. Ethan's face went through several things quickly. The military transfer. You do know him. You don't need the details of that, she said. What you need is to get access to room 218 and delay that 3 o'clock appointment without making it look deliberate. How am I supposed to? You're a doctor, she said. Find a clinical reason. Order a test that takes time. Anything that creates a legitimate documentation trail justifying a delay. She held his gaze. Can you do that? Probably. He didn't look sure. Voss reviews all the 218 orders. He's the attending of record. Then don't flag it high enough that it routes to Voss. Small test, routine justification. Something a first year would order that a chief of surgery wouldn't bother reviewing. She stood up. Do it before 2. She was 3 steps away when he said, wait. She stopped the federal agent. He said, Garrison. He came to my office this morning. Asked about my patient file access history. She turned back slowly. What did you tell him? I told him I'd been reviewing cases as part of a quality improvement project. Ethan's voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort in it. He said that was fine and left. But he looked at my computer, and he asked if I had any printed materials. She thought about the folded papers he'd handed her in the hallway. What did you say? I said no, a pause. Was that the wrong call? No, she said. But you need to understand something. The man who came to see you is not investigating the hospital. He's managing it. There's a difference. Ethan sat with that for a moment. What does that mean for me? It means be careful, she said. And it means do exactly what I told you about the 218 order, and after that, don't do anything else today that you'd have to explain. She left him with the rest of his untouched sandwich and walked back to the elevator. She spent the next hour doing something she hadn't done in years. She was methodical about it and quiet, and she used only resources that were available to anyone with a nursing badge and a working knowledge of how hospitals actually function, as opposed to how they appeared to function. The medical supply system had a secondary tracking interface, older than the main system and less monitored, that logged medication orders by purchase code rather than patient ID. She accessed it from a terminal in the third-floor supply room, her territory, where no one would find her use of the terminal remarkable, and she ran a cross-reference between purchase codes and the dates of the 3 deaths Ethan had found. The medications had been ordered. They were in the system. They just weren't in the patient charts, which meant they'd been ordered under different patient IDs, or under codes that routed to a departmental account rather than individual patient records, and then administered outside the standard documentation flow. This was not a small operation. This was not one bad doctor making unauthorized decisions. This required pharmacy cooperation, documentation suppression, and someone with sufficient administrative access to create and close purchase orders without triggering standard audit flags. She wrote down nothing. She memorized what she found, the way she'd been trained to memorize things structured, systematic, attached to reference points that would hold, and then she logged out and went back to counting supply inventory with the practiced calm of someone who had nothing more interesting to do. At 1:55 p.m., Ethan sent her a text from a number she hadn't given him, but that he'd apparently obtained from the nursing directory. It said only 218 delayed, ordered a repeat echo with vascular consult. Bought maybe 2 hours, she replied. Good. Delete this. He replied. Already did. She almost didn't want to like him. But she did a little. The problem arrived at 2:20 in the form of Agent Garrison, who appeared at the supply closet door with the same controlled composure as the night before and the same specific quality of attention that she was revising her read on with every interaction. He wasn't sloppy. That was the thing. Whoever had trained him had done it well, and whatever he'd been doing in the time since had kept the edges sharp. She'd initially read him as mid-tier federal bureaucrat running a damage control assignment. She was updating that. Nurse Whittick said, "Do you have a few minutes?" "I'm in the middle of inventory," she said. "I can wait." She finished logging the current shelf, closed the tablet, and turned. "What can I do for you?" He came into the closet. Not aggressively, he left the door open, but far enough that this was now a private conversation rather than a doorway exchange. "I need to ask you about this morning, room 312. "I already reported that to the charge nurse," she said. "Unauthorized individual in a restricted room. Possible security badge compromise." "The incident report is filed. I saw the report," he said. "I'm asking you about what happened before security arrived. What did Commander Merritt say to you?" "He was in distress," she said. "I dealt with the immediate safety issue." "Did he say anything about why he was transported here specifically? About his mission?" She looked at Garrison with the steady, slightly dull attentiveness of someone who found federal agents mildly inconvenient, but not alarming. "He asked me what hospital he was in. I told him. He told me his arm hurt. I adjusted his pain management protocol and called it in." A pause. "Is there something specific you're concerned about?" Something moved behind his eyes. She caught it and cataloged it, not frustration exactly, but the particular recalibration of someone who'd come in expecting one kind of conversation and was getting another. "You went into that room twice outside your authorized duties," he said. "That's unusual. The first time, the call light was active, and I was the available nurse. The second time, there was an unauthorized person in the room. I'd call both of those within my duties. You'd call disarming that individual within your duties." She'd been wondering if he'd go there. "I redirected a syringe and removed an access badge," she said. "That's within the scope of patient protection." "Where did you learn to do that?" The question was direct, and there was no clinical answer for it. She met his gaze without shifting. "My father was ex-Army," she said. "He believed in practical self-defense. I spent a lot of time at the range and in the gym a beat. Is there something in my employee file that contradicts that?" He held the silence for 3 seconds. "Employee file is actually quite thin," he said, "for someone your age." "I took time away from nursing," she said. "Personal reasons." "That's documented." "Vaguely documented." "Documented nonetheless." She picked up her tablet. "Is there anything else?" I have 3 more shelves before end of shift. Garrison looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time, not quite controlled. Something underneath it, not anger. Something more careful than that. Like a man who'd come in looking for a supply closet nurse and was starting to suspect he'd found something else and was deciding what to do about it. We'll talk again, he said. Of course, she said. He left. She stood in the supply closet and did not move for 90 seconds, running the conversation back through her head with the same systematic attention she'd applied to the medication records. He knew her file was thin. He'd flagged it specifically, which meant he'd looked and looking, meant she was already on a list somewhere, and being on a list meant the timeline she'd been assuming was too generous. She had less time than she'd thought. She pulled out her phone and did something she hadn't done. In 4 years, she sent a message to a number she'd memorized a long time ago and never used. A number that didn't route through any standard carrier network. A number that belonged to a woman named Delphine Marsh, who was, as far as any official record was concerned, a retired federal public defender living in Tucson. The message had 4 words. Sparrow clock is running. She didn't know if the number still worked. She didn't know if Delphine was still in a position to help. But she knew that if this was what it looked like, she needed someone outside the hospital who understood what was at stake. And Delphine was the only person from her former life who knew the full shape of what had happened in the valley. She put the phone away, picked up the inventory tablet. 3:47 p.m., Ethan Cole texted again. This time the message was longer. They overrode the echo order. Voss personally canceled it and rescheduled the protocol adjustment for 4:30. I tried to push back through the attending system and got locked out. Voss is in 218 now. I don't know how to stop this. She was already moving before she finished reading. Room 218 was on the 2nd floor, south corridor, and she made it down the stairwell in 90 seconds and into the hallway without running. Running was a mistake in hospitals. It drew attention. It changed the temperature of every room you passed, and she walked at the specific purposeful clip that meant I'm going somewhere, with a reason without meaning. Something is wrong. She passed the nursing station. The nurse in duty was occupied with a phone call. She kept going. 218's door was closed but not locked. Pushed it open. Voss was inside with a woman she didn't recognize, mid-40s, dark-haired, a lab coat with no hospital badge, holding a small sealed case the size of a lunchbox. The patient was an older man, the kind of tired-looking that went down to the bone, lying back against pistol with an IV already running, and the particular unfocused look of someone who'd been given something to relax. Voss turned. The expression on his face when he saw her was not surprise. It was something flatter and colder than surprise. You need to leave this room, he said. His IV line has an air bubble, she said. It was the first clinical concern she could articulate in the 3 seconds she'd had to scan the setup, and it happened to be true. There was a small bubble in the secondary line, not life-threatening on its own, but enough to create a documentation requirement that would delay any additional infusion until it was resolved. Get out, Voss said. The air bubble needs to be cleared before any secondary medication is administered, she said, moving toward the IV pole. That's standard protocol. If I observe it and don't address it, that's a reportable failure. The woman with the case took 1 step back. The patient looked at Nora with the cloudy uncertainty of someone trying to figure out if what was happening was good or bad. Whitaker, Voss said, and his voice had dropped to the particular register of someone who was done performing for the room and was now just dealing with a problem. Warning, sir. She held his gaze. Document that you ordered me to leave a patient with a compromised IV line, and I'll go immediately. Need that in writing. The woman with the case put a hand on Voss's arm. Something passed between them, 2 seconds of silent communication, and then Voss said, "We'll return in 30 minutes." And the woman picked up the case, and they walked out. Tora stood in room 218 in the sudden quiet, her heart running about 40 beats faster than she wanted it to, and looked at the man in the bed. "You doing okay?" she asked. "No," he said. His voice was hoarse. "What did they give me?" "I'm going to find out," she said. "What's your name?" "Hector," he said. "Hector Dumas. I was just supposed to come in for my knee. And now they keep—" He stopped, swallowed. "Something's not right." "I know," she said. "Can you get me out of here?" She looked at the door. Voss and the woman with the case would be 30 feet down the corridor, regrouping, deciding how to handle this, and she had maybe 15 minutes before they came back with a security escort, or garrison, or something worse, and Hector Dumas was in a bed with a sedative running through his IV and a compromised chart and 3 dead men in his rearview mirror who'd gone through the same intake process. She made a decision. She'd been making decisions like this for years. The difference was that this time she wasn't choosing to stay silent. She disconnected the secondary IV line. She did it cleanly and quickly, and she documented it in her head. Capped the end. Then she pulled out her phone, and she called Ethan Cole. He picked up on the first ring. 218, she said. I need you here. Now, bring your badge. What are we doing? We're moving a patient, she said. And after that, we're going to need to talk about everything you know, everything I know, and whether you're ready for what comes next. A pause on the line. Then I'm coming. She looked at Hector Dumas, who was watching her with the focused, frightened clarity of a man whose sedative wasn't working as well as someone had planned. They're going to say you're confused, she told him. They're going to say your records don't support what you're experiencing. They're going to have documentation and authority and the weight of this institution behind them. And he said, she thought about Dax Merritt in room 312, calling her by a name she hadn't used in 7 years. She thought about Ethan Cole handing her folded papers in a hallway, doing the right thing badly, which was still doing it. She thought about 3 dead men whose families didn't know what had really happened, and a weapon program that had moved laterally and changed its name and kept running for 7 years, because everyone who could have stopped it had either been killed or scared into silence. She thought about the choice she'd made in the valley, and the choice she'd been making every day since, and the way those 2 choices had finally, inevitably, stopped being compatible. I'm the person who should have done this a long time ago, she said. And then the door behind her opened, and it wasn't Ethan Cole standing there. It was Agent Garrison, and he wasn't alone, and the 2 men behind him weren't federal anything. She could see that in the first half second, in the way they stood, in the hardware on their hips, that was wrong for federal law enforcement and right for something else entirely. And Garrison looked at her with an expression that had finally dropped every pretense of professional neutrality and said, Lieutenant Commander Whitaker, we need to have a very different conversation now. She didn't move. That was the first thing, the stillness, because the instinct was to step back, to put the IV pole between herself and the door, to create distance and angle. And all of those instincts were correct tactically, and also completely wrong for where she was standing and what she needed the next 60 seconds to accomplish. Hector Dumas was in the bed behind her, sedated, clear-headed enough to be scared, dependent on whatever she did next. So she didn't move. She stood in the middle of room 218 and looked at Garrison and said, that name isn't in my employee file. No, Garrison said, it isn't. He came further into the room, and the 2 men behind him fanned slightly, not dramatically, not the way people did it in movies, but the small habitual spread of people who'd been trained to cover angles. Took some digging. You built a good cover. The nursing credentials are real. The employment history is thin but functional. The identity documents are exceptional. Whoever helped you with those knew what they were doing. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. We're past that, Garrison said. Not unkindly. Almost conversational, which was worse. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Whitaker, attached to Special Operations Medical Support Unit 7, declared KIA in the Valley Action 7 years ago. Except you didn't die. And the people who arranged for you to die have spent 3 years wondering where you went. He stopped 6 feet from her. I'm not one of those people. She evaluated that statement the way she'd learned to evaluate everything, not for whether it felt true, but for whether it was consistent with his observable behavior. He'd warned her off the restricted room, which could have been containment. He'd questioned her twice, which could have been profiling. He'd appeared at 218 with 2 men who weren't federal law enforcement, which was harder to reconcile either way. Then who are you, she said. Someone who's been tracking the same program you're trying to dismantle, he said. Except I've been doing it with a cover of my own, and right now that cover is approximately 40 minutes from being permanently burned, because Voss just made a call to someone who was going to send a team to this hospital. The word team landed differently than it would have 20 minutes ago. How long, she said, 40 minutes, maybe less. They'll come in as a private security contractor, executing a patient transfer authorization. Forged documentation, real firearms, and orders to remove Commander Merritt from this hospital and eliminate anyone who can place him here. He paused. Including you. Including this patient. Including the resident who's been pulling files he shouldn't have. Hector Dumas said, from the bed, I'd really like to not be eliminated. Nobody responded to that immediately. The call Voss made, Nora said. You intercepted it. I've been monitoring his communications for 11 days, Garrison said. Which is also how I know about the 3 patients who died. The medication routing through the secondary purchase system, and the fact that Dr. Lena Hart left the state 6 days ago under a name that isn't hers. He looked at her steadily. I came here to stop this. I came here because the documentation trail leads to people high enough that if we don't get the evidence out of this building in the next 40 minutes, it disappears. Along with us, she made a decision. It was the kind of decision that felt like stepping off a ledge, not reckless, not unconsidered, but final. The two men behind you, she said, mine, Garrison said. Both. Tell them to go to the third-floor stairwell and make sure it stays clear. She was already moving toward the door. We're going to need Commander Merritt, ambulatory or mobile. And we're going to need the resident, and we're going to need every piece of documentation we can carry out of this building before whoever Voss called gets here. Agreed, Garrison said. And we need to move this patient first. Ethan Cole arrived at the second-floor nursing station, 40 seconds after she called him back, slightly out of breath with the look of someone who'd been running through staircases, trying not to look like he was running. He took in Garrison and the two men and Nora's expression and didn't say anything for a moment. The patient in 218 needs to be transferred to a private room in the West Wing, Nora said. Clinically justified, you're documenting concerns about his current placement related to the medication anomalies. You have the chart access to initiate it. Voss will flag it. Voss is going to be occupied, she said. Do it now. Use your own credentials. Make it clean. And then pull everything you have, every printed page, every notation, anything physical, and meet me on the third floor in 15 minutes. Ethan looked at Garrison. I don't know who you are, Ethan said. Nobody helpful ever does, Garrison said. It wasn't reassuring, but Ethan turned and started typing at the nursing station terminal with the focused speed of someone who decided the time for second guessing was finished. Nora went back into 218, disconnected Hector Dumas from the secondary line entirely, documented a nursing assessment in the chart that established a legitimate clinical basis for the medication hold, and helped him sit up. Can you walk? She asked. I can walk, he said. My knee is bad, but I can walk. Then we're going to walk, she said. Getting Merritt out of bed was a different problem. He was ambulatory barely and at cost, and with the specific grim determination of someone who'd been ambulatory under much worse conditions, and was drawing on that memory now, but ambulatory. Garrison's two men had already cleared the third-floor stairwell and established that the corridor between 312 and the east staircase was momentarily unobserved by anyone connected to Voss. The window was small. They moved through it. Merritt gripped the IV pole with his functional hand and walked with the rolling, controlled gait of someone distributing weight away from a specific pain source, and he didn't make a sound about it. And Nora stayed at his left side and monitored his color and his breathing and the way he held his jaw, because those were the things that would tell her if he was about to go down before he knew it himself. You look terrible, she told him. You look exactly the same, he said. I look completely different. Same eyes, he said. Never forget eyes. They made it to a conference room on the third floor. Not the one with the camera coverage Garrison had already identified as active, but a smaller one on the interior corridor that the hospital used for departmental meetings, and that had, usefully, a door that locked from the inside, and no window to the hallway. Garrison's two men she'd gotten names now, Reyes and Taft, both with the compact economy of movement that meant military background took up positions outside. Ethan arrived 3 minutes later with a folder thick enough that he'd had to fold it to fit under his arm, his face flushed and his lanyard half-twisted from moving fast. Hector sat a conference chair and breathed steadily, and looked like a man who was running on the particular adrenaline of having almost died without quite understanding the mechanism. Okay, Ethan said. What are we actually doing? Garrison laid it out in 8 minutes. He was precise, and he didn't editorialize, and he moved through the structure of what he knew the way someone moves through a briefing point to point, evidence to inference, inference to action required. The program had started as a legitimate research initiative under a defense contractor called Meridian Applied Sciences, studying accelerated tissue regeneration under combat conditions. The science was real. The initial funding was appropriated. And then at some point, in the 4th year of research, the clinical director had made a decision to expand the trial parameters without authorization, without ethics review, and without the knowledge of the soldiers being treated. Compounds they'd developed required human metabolic data that couldn't be replicated in controlled trials. They needed subjects who were already injured, already in medical facilities, already receiving treatment subjects whose deaths, if they occurred, would read as complications of existing conditions, rather than consequences of unauthorized experimentation. The valley had been where they'd first field-tested a delivery mechanism. Nora's unit had found the testing installation, and rather than risk exposure, The people running Meridian had used their contacts in the command structure to eliminate the witnesses. 7 years later, Garrison said the program is in its third iteration. Different contractor name on paper Tessic Biomedical. Different lead researcher. Same fundamental structure, same ethical violations, same body count. He looked at Ethan's folder. What you found in those charts is the current delivery protocol. The medications aren't in standard formularies because they haven't been approved. They're being administered under falsified treatment codes that route to a departmental research account rather than individual patient records, Voss Nora said. Voss is the clinical coordinator for this facility. He's not the architect, he's a node. He recruits appropriate patients, manages the documentation suppression, and receives compensation through a consulting agreement with a shell company that traces back to Tessic. Garrison paused. The woman who was with him in 218, Dr. Lena Hart, she's actually listed as a research associate at Tessic under her real name. Her hospital credentials are fraudulent. Ethan made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The 3 patients who died, Merritt said from the chair where he'd been sitting with the stillness of someone conserving everything. Their families. Don't know, Garrison said. The death certificates list complications consistent with their admitting diagnoses. Nothing to trigger an independent investigation. Hector Dumas almost became the 4th, Nora said. Everyone looked at Hector. He raised one hand briefly. Still here. Right, Garrison said. Which is why he checked his watch. Approximately 27 minutes before the team Voss called arrives. And we need to have a plan for what happens when they do. The plan had 4 parts, and none of them were clean. And Nora was the one who laid it out, because she was the one who'd been in situations where the options were all bad, and the job was to find the least bad one and commit to it without hesitation. First, the documentation. Everything Ethan had, the printed records, the chart anomalies, the medication routing data she'd pulled from the secondary system needed to leave the building in a form that couldn't be confiscated. Garrison had a secure uplink on a device that operated independently of the hospital's network. The records would be encrypted and transmitted to an external server with redundant copies. Second, Merritt's testimony. He'd been tracking this for 18 months, and he had a documentation trail of his own stored, he informed them, on an encrypted drive in the lining of his kit bag, which was currently in a hospital storage locker on the 1st floor under a check-in number that Garrison's men retrieved in the time it took Nora to check Merritt's blood pressure, which was concerning but survivable. Third, Hector Dumas. He needed to be physically out of the building before the team arrived, because he was the living evidence of an interrupted protocol, and they would not leave him in place. Taft drove. Hector was going to a specific address that Garrison had pre-arranged with the kind of forward planning that told Nora he'd been expecting this moment for longer than 11 days. Fourth, the remaining evidence inside the hospital. The pharmacy records, the departmental research account, the physical compounds that were almost certainly somewhere on site. Without those, the documentation they had was strong, but not complete strong enough to open an investigation. Maybe not strong enough to close one against people with the resources Meridian and Tessic had demonstrated they were willing to deploy. The pharmacy, she said. Sub-basement. There's a controlled substance storage room that has secondary access through the research services corridor. Voss would need that corridor for the medication routing to work the way the records show. I can get us into the research corridor, Ethan said. My department has legitimate access. But the storage room itself, I have a universal access card, Garrison said. Everyone looked at him. I've been here 11 days, he said. I prepared. They split. Reyes stayed with Merritt, who was in no condition to move again, and who Nora installed back in a temporary resting position with explicit instructions about what to do if his blood pressure spiked and what not to do under circumstances involving the hospital call system. Garrison and Nora took the stairwell to the sub-basement. Ethan went through the research corridor with his department badge and his folder of evidence and the slightly hunted look of a man who'd spent the morning being a conscientious doctor and was now doing something he'd have no clinical framework for explaining. The sub-basement was the part of hospitals that patients never saw, and most staff rarely visited maintenance corridors. Storage, the particular institutional silence of fluorescent lights and concrete that had no reason to be anything other than functional. The research services corridor branched off from the main maintenance passage and was marked only by a keycard reader and a small sign that said restricted authorized personnel. Garrison's card worked. The door opened. The corridor was narrow and cold and smelled like refrigeration. Doors on the left, 3 of them, all marked with research codes rather than descriptions. The third one was the one she would have chosen furthest from the entrance, closest to the secondary freight elevator, positioned for access that didn't route through the main hospital traffic. The card worked on that one too. Inside refrigerated units, locked with digital displays showing temperature ranges consistent with biological compounds. A workstation. Printed logs in a binder on the shelf beside the door, actual physical logs, the kind that existed because electronic records could be deleted. And researchers, even careful ones, always kept paper backup for their own protection. She photographed everything. Garrison's secure device had a camera function, and she used it systematically, shelf by shelf, unit by log page. It took 11 minutes. She had learned patience as a tactical skill a long time ago, and she applied it now, even though her internal clock was counting down with the precision of something she could feel in her sternum. Garrison photographed the compound labels on the refrigerated units. Neither of them touched the units themselves. The documentation was enough, and disturbing the physical evidence before federal custody was established would compromise the chain. They were walking back through the research corridor when the lights went out. Not a flicker. A full-cut emergency lighting kicked in after 2 seconds, red-tinged and dim, throwing the corridor into the particular shadow that made distances unreliable and details disappear. "That's not a coincidence," Garrison said. "No," she said. She heard the door at the far end of the corridor, the one that connected to the freight elevator lobby, open. She counted footsteps. 3 people moving with the distributed spacing of a team, not the bunched-up movement of staff responding to a power issue. They'd come early. 27 minutes had been optimistic. She pulled Garrison into the doorway of the second research room and held the door cracked. He had his weapon out. She registered that without comment, the same way she'd registered the weight and positionings of his sidearm when he'd first appeared in 218. She had nothing comparable, and she didn't waste time wishing for it. The team moved down the corridor with the systematic patience of people who'd cleared spaces before, checking each doorway, not rushing, which meant they were confident, and confident meant they'd likely already secured the exits. 3 in this corridor, which meant however many more were deployed above, in the main hospital on the 3rd floor, covering the conference room. She thought about Reyes with Merritt, about Ethan somewhere in the building with his folder, about Hector Dumas, who had hopefully cleared the parking structure by now, with Taft. 3. She needed to know if they were the whole team or the advance. "How many total?" She breathed to Garrison's source, said 6 to 8. He breathed back. 6 to 8, 3 here, 3 to 5 above. The first man in the corridor stopped outside the 3rd research room, the one with the compounds. He tried the door. It was still locked. He turned to the second man and said something in a low voice that she couldn't fully catch. Something about the access log, which meant they knew someone had been in there recently, which meant they'd accessed the hospital's keycard system, which meant whoever had sent them had deeper reach into the hospital infrastructure than Voss. Garrison shifted beside her. She put a hand on his arm. Not yet. The 3rd man had stopped in the middle of the corridor and was doing something she recognized. After a moment, he was listening. Not to voices, to the particular quality of air in enclosed spaces, the way sound and pressure and the small unconscious sounds of human presence changed a corridor that shouldn't have anyone in it. He was good. He was going to find them in about 15 seconds. She made the calculation quickly. Move now, controlled, or wait and let him close the distance until she had no angle. Moving now meant the element of surprise was hers instead of his. Waiting meant she'd be reacting. She looked at Garrison and indicated door now, him first. He went through the door and she was behind him, and the corridor noise changed immediately. The team's body language shifted the way body language does when people who are looking for something suddenly hear it. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not clean, and it was not dramatic, and it did not look like anything from a movie. It looked like what it actually was. 3 trained people processing a rapidly changing environment against 2 people who had a half-second advantage and were using it with complete focus. Garrison took the 3rd man, the one who'd been listening, with the decisive efficiency of someone whose training was very current. Nora moved left because left was where the 2nd man's attention wasn't, and she used the emergency lighting shadows and the narrow corridor and the specific anatomical knowledge of someone who'd spent years understanding how bodies failed in order to put him down, without either of them taking damage she couldn't afford. The 1st man was the problem. He'd gotten distance, and she heard him on comms one word, a location call, before Garrison came around the corner and made that a shorter problem. All of it took 40 seconds. She stood in the dim red corridor and breathed and checked herself for damage, nothing structural. Her left forearm had taken a grab that was going to bruise deeply. That was the extent of it. Garrison was checking the three men efficiently, zip-ting from his jacket pocket, checking comms devices. They called up, he said. I know, she was already moving toward the stairwell. How long until the ones above know something's wrong? 2 minutes, he said. Maybe 3. They'll try to raise these 3, and when they don't get a response. 3 minutes, she said. We need to be on the 3rd floor. They came up through the maintenance, stairwell, and into the 3rd floor corridor at the east end, which put them behind the position where the remaining team members would most logically set up to control access to the conference room. She could hear them before she saw them, not voices, but the particular quality of boots on linoleum, and the small sounds of people in positions, waiting. 2 in the corridor outside the conference room. 1 more somewhere, she guessed the stairwell at the west end. Garrison pointed at himself, and then toward the west stairwell. She pointed at herself, and then at the corridor. He looked at her like he had something to say about that division of labor. She shook her head once. He went. She walked into the corridor from the east end, at a normal pace, clipboard in hand, the particular purposeful movement of a nurse who was going somewhere specific and was slightly annoyed about it. The first man saw her at 20 feet, and the second one a second later, and they were both processing the incongruity. A nurse, no weapon visible, moving with confident direction which gave her 4 steps. 4 steps was enough. She didn't go for the first man. She went for the space between them, which disrupted both of their engagement angles simultaneously, and she moved with the specific decisive economy of someone who'd run through close-quarters scenarios, enough times that the physical execution of them didn't require conscious thought. The first man's arm, the second man's weight and center. The momentum of both of them redirected into each other rather than into her. It was not painless. She took an elbow across the jaw that rattled her teeth and made the corridor tilt briefly, and the second man got a hand in her hair before she broke that contact, and none of it was precise or controlled in the way that training made it look. But when Garrison came back from the west stairwell 30 seconds later, both men were down. She was sitting against the wall with her back to it, pressing her fingers against her jaw, checking with professional detachment whether anything had moved that shouldn't have. You okay? Garrison said. Functional, she said. It was the most accurate, available answer. She stood up, went to the conference room door, and knocked twice the pattern she'd established with Reyes before they'd split up. The door opened, Reyes with his weapon, Merritt still in the chair, looking at her face with an expression that was complicated. The jaw, he said. I know, she said. You should ice it. I'll ice it later, she said. We have a bigger problem. Because when she'd been in the corridor, she'd heard the comms. She hadn't caught all of it, but she'd caught enough. The team Voss had called in more components than Garrison's source had estimated, and the word she'd caught most clearly, repeated twice in the transmission, before she'd been occupied with more immediate concerns, was a word that changed everything she'd been assuming about the timeline. Broadcast. Someone had already contacted a journalist. The plan to get the evidence out through Garrison's encrypted uplink was already partially moot because someone inside this hospital, or connected to the people trying to suppress this investigation, had preemptively contacted a media outlet, not to expose the story but to control it, to get ahead of it, to establish a narrative that positioned the deaths as tragic research complications, the documentation anomalies as administrative errors, and most critically Evelyn Whitaker as an unstable former operative operating under a fraudulent identity who had interfered with legitimate medical research. They weren't just trying to eliminate the evidence. They were trying to eliminate her credibility before she could use it. We need Daniel Price, Garrison said. He'd heard it too. She looked at him. You know that name. Investigative journalist. He's been working a parallel thread on Tessic Biomedical for 3 months. The one person in the media landscape who has enough independent documentation to counter whatever their version is going to be. Garrison was already on his phone, but he needs a primary source on record named. On camera. Norris stood in the conference room doorway and looked at Merritt and Ethan and Reyes and thought about what named and on camera meant for the woman who had spent 7 years not having a name. Get him on the phone, she said. She looked at Merritt. You told me once that what happened in the valley couldn't stay buried forever. I said that, he said. I told you to run, you did. I'm done running, she said. And that was the moment, not dramatic, not announced. Just a woman in a borrowed hospital corridor, making a decision that had been building for 7 years when she stopped being Nora Whitaker and started being again herself. Garrison had Price on the line in 90 seconds. She could hear the journalist's voice through the phone alert fast. The voice of someone who'd been waiting for a call like this and knew it when it came. "Garrison," she said. She held out her hand for the phone. He gave it to her. "Mr. Price," she said. "My name is Evelyn Whitaker. I was a lieutenant commander in a classified special operations medical unit. I was declared killed in action 7 years ago. I am currently inside Hargrove Memorial Hospital with a Navy SEAL commander, a resident physician, and documented evidence of an ongoing illegal human experimentation program run under the cover of a defense contractor called Tessic Biomedical." She paused. "I need you to be at this hospital in the next 30 minutes, and I need you to bring your documentation on Tessic, and I need you to be prepared to go on record with everything you have." A silence on the other end. "Then where specifically?" "Third floor east," she said. "Come through the maintenance entrance off the loading dock. Don't use the main lobby. Who's going to let me in?" "I am," she said. She handed the phone back to Garrison and turned to face the corridor. 30 minutes. They had 30 minutes to hold this floor, maintain physical control of the evidence, keep Merritt stable, and establish a media record that would make whatever the other side was about to broadcast irrelevant. And then she heard it, not footsteps, not a comms burst. Something heavier, the particular deep percussion of a security door being breached, coming from the direction of the main stairwell. On the west end, the stairwell where Garrison had taken down the third member of the advance team. Except the advance team was down. All 5 of them accounted for, which meant this was someone else. She looked at Garrison. He was already moving. "That's not the contractor," he said. "No," she said. Because the sound that followed the organized, systematic sound of multiple people moving in coordinated formation through a hospital stairwell was a sound she recognized. Not from hospitals, not from contractor operations. It was the sound of a federal tactical team making entry. And the question, in the 3 seconds before they came through the door, and everything changed again, was whether they were there because Garrison had finally found backup he could trust, or because the people who wanted this buried had enough reach to send federal assets against her. The door at the end of the corridor opened, and the lead agent who came through it looked at Nora and said, "Which one of you is Evelyn Whitaker?" "I am," Nora said. She said it without stepping forward, without raising her hands, without doing any of the performative things that people did when they wanted to signal compliance. She just said it, flat and clear, and watched the lead agent process the gap between what he'd presumably been briefed about unstable former operative, fraudulent identity, interference with legitimate research, and what he was actually looking at, which was a woman in scrubs with a bruised jaw standing in a hospital corridor with the particular stillness of someone who'd already made every decision that mattered. The agent was mid-40s, close-cropped gray at the temples, the kind of face that had seen enough to stop showing much. He had 6 people behind him in tactical configuration, which was more than the situation in front of him required, which meant someone had given him a significant threat assessment. He looked at her. He looked at Garrison. He looked at Merritt, who was in the doorway of the conference room, holding the IV pole with one hand because he'd run out of other options for staying upright, and who looked like exactly what he was, a severely injured Navy SEAL commander who had absolutely no intention of sitting back down. "Agent Calloway," the lead agent said. "Inspector General's Office, Department of Defense." He held up credentials long enough for her to read the issuing agency. "We've been running a parallel investigation into Tessic Biomedical for 7 weeks. We received a transmission from this location approximately 20 minutes ago containing encrypted documentation. We're here to secure the evidence and the witnesses." "Who authorized this response?" Garrison said. "Deputy IG Marlowe directly." Calloway looked at Garrison with the expression of someone who'd been briefed on his existence and had questions about his methodology. "Your uplink triggered our monitoring protocol. We've been waiting for someone to get close enough to the physical records to make this move." A pause. "You could have called us." "I didn't know if I could trust you," Garrison said. "That's fair," Calloway said, in a tone that suggested it was genuinely fair and also genuinely inconvenient. "We have that problem on our end, too." It was, Nora thought, a remarkably honest conversation to be having in a hospital corridor with 5 people on the floor in zip ties and a federal tactical team blocking the stairwell. "The men in the sub-basement," she said. "We passed them," Calloway said. "My people are securing them now. We'll need statements on that engagement." His eyes went briefly to her jaw. "You have medical personnel on site?" "I am medical personnel," she said. He absorbed without comment. "The contractor team what Voss called in, we have confirmation they're standing down." When the uplink transmission went out, it also flagged 3 separate law enforcement agencies simultaneously. Voss was detained at the parking structure 7 minutes ago, attempting to leave the building. He looked around the corridor, the men on the floor, the tactical team, conference room full of people who'd spent the last hour making decisions under impossible time pressure. We need to move everyone to a secure location and start taking statements. All of you, there's a journalist coming, Nora said. I called him before I knew you were here. Calloway's expression shifted in a way that was not quite a wince. Name Daniel Price, a pause. He's been in contact with our office independently. He has documentation we don't. Another pause. He's also currently in the park striking questioned by 2 of my agents because he came in through the loading dock like someone told him to, and that triggered our perimeter. She almost smiled. Almost. Let him through, she said. Calloway looked at her for a moment, with the particular expression of a federal agent who's assessing the fact that a woman operating under a fabricated identity for 7 years was currently directing the logistical flow of his operation and deciding how he felt about it. He got on his radio, let the journalist through, escort him to the 3rd floor. The next 2 hours were the kind of controlled chaos that looked like order from the outside and felt like barely managed collapse from the inside. Calloway's team secured the floor. The contractor team, 6 men total. The 3 from the sub-basement and 3 more, who'd been positioned at building exits, were in federal custody before the hour turned. The pharmacy's sub-basement was locked and preserved as an evidence site, with 2 of Calloway's agents stationed at the door. The hospital administrator, a small, pale man named Ferris, who'd been in his office entirely unaware of what his building had spent the past 2 weeks doing, was informed of the situation by one of Calloway's people and responded by sitting down very slowly and not saying anything for approximately 90 seconds. Voss was in the back of a federal vehicle in the parking structure. She didn't see him, but she knew he was there, and she found that she felt almost nothing about it, not satisfaction, not relief. Just the flat acknowledgement of a fact that had finally aligned with the truth of things. Dr. Lena Hart was apprehended at a regional airport 40 miles out, still under the name she'd been using, trying to board a flight that would have connected to a non-extradition destination. That information came through Calloway's radio while they were setting up in the conference room, and Ethan Cole, who was sitting across the table with his folder of documents in front of him and the look of a man who'd aged 3 years in one afternoon, let out a breath that was long enough to suggest he'd been holding it since morning. Daniel Price arrived on the 3rd floor with dried mud on his shoes from cutting across the landscaping to reach the loading dock and a recorder already running in his jacket pocket, which Nora noticed and did not object to. He was younger than she'd expected, early 30s. Wire-framed glasses, the specific alert tension of someone who'd been tracking a story for months and could feel it finally resolving under his hands. He looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to be too openly what it was, which was the expression of someone meeting a source who'd just handed them the story of their career. You actually exist, he said. I actually exist, she said. I've had a file with your name in it for 4 months, he said. I found a reference in a procurement document that didn't make sense, and I pulled the thread, and eventually the thread led to a Valley operation that was classified at a level I couldn't access, and a KIA record that had some inconsistencies. He paused. I thought you were dead. People kept telling me that, she said. Calloway's people had set up a recording station in the conference room, 2 cameras, a stenographer, and the kind of deliberate procedural formality that meant everything said in this room was going to matter in a courtroom. Merritt was in a chair that had been adjusted to account for his injuries, with a medical monitor that Nora had insisted on, and that Calloway had not objected to, because Merritt's blood pressure was still doing things that warranted watching. Ethan was at the table with his documentation. Garrison was in the corner giving a parallel statement to one of Calloway's agents, in a voice too low to track. Price set up his own recorder alongside Calloway's equipment, with Calloway's explicit consent, because the IG's office had apparently decided that the media record and the legal record, serving each other's interests, was a feature rather than a problem in this particular case. Nora sat down at the table. She hadn't sat still in 4 hours. The chair felt like an event. Calloway looked at her from across the table and said, "Ready?" She thought about 7 years. She thought about the Valley, about the night she'd held a position alone while the survivors ran, about the 4 days she'd spent getting herself out through channels that didn't exist, and the 6 months she'd spent becoming someone else in the 4 years she'd spent being that someone else in a supply closet, in a hospital that had turned out to be the center of the thing she'd been running from. Yes, she said. She talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Not continuously, Calloway interrupted with clarifying questions, Price asked things that came from his own documentation and needed to be connected to what she was saying, and twice she stopped, because Merritt was corroborating something from his own timeline, and the details needed to be reconciled carefully. But the core of it was continuous, and she delivered it the way she'd learned to deliver debriefs, a long time ago, chronological, specific without editorializing, letting the facts carry the weight, because facts were the thing that held up in rooms where everything else got contested. She told them about the valley, the installation they'd found, the documentation her unit had transmitted before the ambush, the specific indicators in the ambush itself that told her immediately. It wasn't random contact, but a coordinated kill operation, and the 40 minutes she'd spent after sending Merritt and the survivors out before she could move herself. 40 minutes in which she'd memorized everything she'd seen at the installation, because she understood even then that her testimony might be the only record that survived. She told them about the 7 years, the construction of Nora Whitaker, the nursing degree which was real, earned under a name that wasn't hers from an institution that would have to be notified at some point, that one of their graduates had been operating under a false identity, a problem for later, a problem she'd face when later arrived. Careful invisibility. The particular discipline of building a life small enough that no one would look at it twice. She told them about Hargrove Memorial, about Voss and the trauma bay and the gauze pads and the memo, which she'd kept in her pocket, and which she now pulled out and unfolded on the conference table, because it was, in its small way, part of the record too, the piece of paper that had put her in a supply closet where she'd been when Merritt arrived, which was the only reason she'd been positioned to see him, to enter that room, to be standing in this conference room now, instead of somewhere else entirely. Calloway looked at the memo. He looked at her. "You kept it," he said. "I keep things," she said. Price was writing something. Merritt from his chair said, "She kept everything. That was always the thing about her. She kept everything, and she never flinched." It was probably the most personal thing he'd said since she'd walked back into his room, and it landed in the conference room, sat there, and nobody tried to move it along immediately. The first break in the formal statement happened at the 4-hour mark, when Calloway's radio delivered a piece of information that changed the shape of what they were doing. Tessic Biomedical Corporate Headquarters, a facility outside Atlanta that appeared on paper to be a research and development campus, had filed an emergency motion in federal court 40 minutes ago. The motion cited national security concerns and sought an injunction against the release of any documentations obtained during what it characterized as an unauthorized search of proprietary research materials at an affiliated medical facility. The motion had been filed by a law firm that represented, among other clients, 3 former senior officials of intelligence agencies, and it had been assigned to a federal judge who had, according to a notation in Calloway's file that he read aloud with the controlled tone of someone delivering very bad news carefully, previously ruled in favor of national security exemptions in 2 cases involving the same contractor network. The room went quiet in a way that had weight to it. "They're trying to seal it," Ethan said. "They're trying to bury it before it reaches a jury," Garrison said from the corner. Price looked at Nora. "The transmission that went out from Garrison's uplink, where exactly did it go?" "Redundant external servers," Garrison said. "Encrypted, access controlled." "But controlled by whom?" Price said. "If they get an injunction against the IG's office." "The servers aren't under the IG's jurisdiction," Garrison said. "They're private infrastructure." "But the evidence obtained in the hospital is," Calloway said. He was already on his phone, stepping toward the window. "Deputy Marlowe needs to know about this motion." Nora watched him move away and thought about the injunction and the judge and the law firm with its intelligence agency connections, and she thought about 7 years of a program that had survived by moving laterally, changing names, changing structures, changing the institutional frameworks that supported it while the core kept running. It had survived because it was very good at legal and institutional self-protection, and it was demonstrating right now that it was still good at it. "Price," she said. He looked at her. "Your documentation on Tessic," she said. "The thread you pulled from the procurement record. What form is it in?" "Digital primary copies on a server that's not connected to this investigation," he said. "And physical in my office." "Not your office," she said. "If they're filing injunctions, they're also filing discovery requests. And your office is not protected from my—" "I moved everything last week," he said. "When I thought this was getting close. It's in a location that has journalist shield protections, and that would require a separate legal action to access." He held her gaze. "I've been doing this for 7 years, too. I'm careful." She believed him. "There's something else," Merritt said. Everyone looked at him. He'd been conserving himself for the last hour less visibly than before, but she'd been tracking it, the way his color came and went, the way he controlled his breathing around the pain. Now he was leaning forward in the adjusted chair with the deliberate effort of someone who'd decided expenditure was worth it. The Valley documentation, he said. The original transmission. What my unit sent before the ambush. It would have been received and suppressed by whoever in the command structure coordinated the ambush, Calloway said. 7 years ago. It's not, Merritt said. Another silence, this one different. I received a copy, he said. Not through official channels. There was a signal specialist in the unit, Daria Osi. She was running a secondary personal encryption protocol on everything she transmitted. Standard operational paranoia. The kind of thing people do in environments where they don't fully trust the chain. When the transmission went out, she sent a simultaneous encrypted copy to a dead drop server that only she had the access credentials for. He paused. She died in the ambush, but she'd given me the access credentials the night before because she had a bad feeling about the op, and she wanted someone else to have them. Nora stared at him. You've had the original documentation for 7 years, she said. I've had the access for 7 years, he said. I couldn't retrieve it without revealing that I had it, and I couldn't reveal that I had it without knowing who I could trust with it. And I couldn't know who I could trust until he looked at her. Until now. Calloway was back from the window, phone call apparently completed, and he'd clearly caught enough of the last 30 seconds to understand what was happening. If that documentation is authentic and retrievable, it predates everything else we have by 7 years. It establishes the original program, the original cover-up, and the original chain of command that authorized the ambush. It would make the injunction irrelevant, Garrison said. You can't seal evidence that's been in independent possession for 7 years by a witness with standing. Can you access it now? Calloway said to Merritt. I need a secure terminal. And 30 minutes, Merritt said. You need a doctor first, Nora said, after Merritt said. Now, she said, your blood pressure has been climbing for the last hour, and you've been ignoring it because you're used to ignoring things. And I'm telling you as a medical professional that 30 minutes of access time isn't worth a hemorrhagic event. She held his gaze. We get a physician to assess you. We stabilize what needs stabilizing. And then you access the server. In that order. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was going to argue and then thought better of it. Fine, he said. Thank you, she said. Physician Calloway produced was a federal medical officer who arrived within 20 minutes and spent another 15 assessing Merritt with the efficient thoroughness of someone accustomed to evaluating injured personnel in non-ideal conditions. The assessment was, as Nora had privately calculated, not catastrophic. The injuries were serious, and the exertion of the past several hours had set back the recovery timeline significantly. But nothing had ruptured or rebuilt in ways that were immediately life-threatening. Merritt received an adjusted pain management protocol that would let him function for the next several hours without compromising his cognition, along with a set of instructions he would probably follow selectively, which was his right. While that was happening, Ethan Cole was in a secondary conference room giving a detailed statement about every file access, every chart anomaly, every conversation, organized in the chronological order that Nora had coached him on in the 90 seconds they'd had together before Calloway's team had formally separated the witnesses. He was thorough, and he was precise. And he made one mistake, which was referring to the first time Nora had told him to stop accessing the restricted files without the contextual setup that established why she'd known what she knew, and one of Calloway's agents had to bring them together briefly to reconcile the timeline. Hector Dumas called from the safe location where Taft had taken him. He'd been examined by a private physician that Garrison had prearranged another layer of preparation she hadn't known about, and he was physically stable, the sedative mostly metabolized, his knee still bad and likely to remain bad, and he was ready to give a statement as soon as someone came to him, because he was not, he said very clearly, coming back to that hospital voluntarily. Understandable, Calloway's agent told him. Garrison was still in his corner, working through his own documentation with an agent who was clearly from a different office than Calloway's, and who had the air of someone conducting a parallel assessment of Garrison's methods and decisions rather than his evidence. That conversation looked like it had several more hours left in it, and Nora sat in the main conference room in the 40 minutes between Merritt's medical assessment and the moment Calloway set up the secure terminal, and she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She stopped moving. She sat in the chair with her hands on the table, and she looked at the wall, and she stayed there. Price, to his credit, did not try to interview her during those 40 minutes. He sat at the other end of the table and reviewed his own notes, and let her have the stillness. She would remember that later, the specific decency of him understanding that she needed it. She thought about Daria Ose, who had run a secondary encryption protocol out of operational paranoia and handed Merritt the credentials the night before she died because she had a bad feeling. She thought about the particular texture of that kind of person, not heroic, in the way stories made heroes, but careful and suspicious and right, in the way that careful, suspicious people were sometimes right in ways that mattered for years afterward. Daria Ose had been 26 years old. She'd died in a valley that didn't officially exist, and the people who'd arranged her death had kept running for 7 years. And her dead drop server had been sitting there for 7 years holding the original documentation, waiting. Nora thought about patience as a form of justice, about how long things actually took in the real world when the people on the wrong side had money and legal infrastructure and institutional reach, about how the right outcome was not inevitable and did not arrive on schedule and required people to keep carrying things that were very heavy for very long times. Then Calloway came back and said the terminal was ready, and she stood up. Merritt accessed the server in 22 minutes. The documentation was intact. 7 years of encrypted storage in a server infrastructure that had simply kept running because Daria Oses had set it up to keep running, with automatic storage fees drawn from an account that had enough reserve to maintain the service for a decade. The files were time-stamped, authenticated, and transmitted with the original encryption signatures that established chain of custody going back to the night of the Valley operation. It was everything: the installation assessment, the weapons testing documentation, the transmission logs that showed exactly who in the command structure had received the intelligence before the ambush. And embedded in the installation assessment, something that Nora had documented but had not fully understood the significance of at the time, a reference to a secondary site, a domestic facility, that served as the research base for the program that the Valley installation had been testing. The secondary site was listed by a project code. Calloway's analyst, working on a laptop at the conference table, ran the project code against a federal contractor database that Calloway had access to, and the result came back in 4 minutes. The project code matched a TESIC biomedical research designation. Same company, the same program. 7 years of continuous operation, from a Valley installation to a hospital subbasement, with the documentation to prove the thread connecting all of it. That's the chain of custody, Calloway said. He was very still, in the way of someone who'd been building towards something for a long time and had just felt the last piece settle. That connects the original program to the current iteration. That's the case. He got on his phone. What followed was procedural and fast federal warrants expanded. TESIC Biomedical's corporate headquarters placed under simultaneous federal hold. The law firm that had filed the injunction notified that the evidence base they'd been trying to contain had just expanded to include 7-year-old authenticated transmissions that predated any authority they could claim. And the judge assigned to the injunction request is informed by the deputy IG's office that the motion needed to be reviewed in light of substantially changed circumstances. The injunction was withdrawn by TESIC's legal team before midnight. Nora heard that last piece through Calloway's radio at 11:47 p. Sitting in the conference room that she'd been in for most of the past 6 hours, with Merritt asleep in the chair beside her, actually asleep, the monitored sleep of someone who'd finally run out of the particular fuel that had been keeping him upright, and Ethan Cole at the table, reviewing a second round of questions from Calloway's documentation team, and Price, in the corner of the room, writing something that was going to be published before morning. She was not fine. Her jaw had swelled significantly, and her left forearm had the deep purple pattern of a bad grab, and she had a tension headache that had been building since the sub-basement, and she was hungry in the specific hollow way of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for 8 hours. But the injunction was withdrawn. The warrants were active. The documentation was in federal custody with redundant copies in Price's protected location and on Garrison's external servers. Voss was in processing, Hart was in custody, the contractor team was in custody, and the original Valley documentation, with its authenticated chain of custody, was now the center of a case that connected the present program to its origins 7 years ago and named the people in the command structure who had authorized the ambush. Calloway came back into the room at 11:52 and sat down across from her. "There's something you should know," he said. She looked at him. "The command structure contacts named in OC's documentation," he said. "We started running them as soon as we had the files. 3 are deceased, 2 are retired, and one of them," he stopped, looked at the table briefly, then back at her. One of them is currently serving as a senior advisor to the Senate Armed Services Committee. She held that he would have known, she said. Everything we've done tonight, he would have been briefed. His access to classified federal law enforcement activities is significant. Yes. Calloway said it carefully. The kind of careful that wasn't evasion, but was the measured precision of a man who understood what he was saying and wanted to say it exactly right. Which means he knew this investigation was running. And it means he may have been in a position to provide information to people who wanted it contained. The contractor team, she said. They came early. 27 minutes early, yes, Calloway said. Someone told them we were moving faster than expected. That's what the timeline suggests, Calloway said. She sat with that. The shape of it, the particular recursive depth of a corruption that had been operating for 7 years and had survived by knowing always what was coming before it arrived, because it had people positioned to see it first. Is he being detained? She said. He's being monitored, Calloway said. We can't detain a Senate advisor on preliminary evidence without... I know the process, she said. We'll have a warrant within 48 hours, he said. The timeline on the documentation is clear, and he's named specifically. 48 hours, she said. I know, he said. She looked at the table. At the memo she'd smoothed out and placed at the edge of the conference room surface, Voss's memo, effective immediately, supply inventory, until further notice, and thought about all the things that had happened, because she'd been in a supply closet when Dax Merritt came through this hospital. Thought about how different the shape of everything would have looked if she'd been somewhere else that night, if Voss had not reassigned her, if Voss had not been so confident that humiliating her was consequence-free. She almost said something about the irony of that. Then she didn't, because irony was for people who had the distance to appreciate it, and she was still too close. 48 hours, she said again to herself more than to Calloway. And then Price looked up from the corner where he'd been writing, and he said, in a tone that was carefully neutral, I need to show you something. He brought his laptop to the table and turned the screen toward her. It was a news article, published 11 minutes ago by a media outlet that she recognized, not Price's organization, a different one, and the byline was not a name she knew. The headline was in large type, and the article had already collected 300 shares. Military whistleblower or rogue operative. Inside the Hargrove Memorial incident and the woman behind it. She read the first 3 paragraphs. She read them without her expression changing, with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to receive bad information without letting it show. The article characterized her as a former special operations officer with a history of unauthorized independent action who had constructed a fraudulent identity and infiltrated a civilian medical facility, and who had obstructed legitimate federal security operations under the cover of a falsified whistleblower narrative. It quoted 2 anonymous senior intelligence officials. It named her by both names. It described the Tessic biomedical research program as a legally authorized study that had been compromised by her interference. It had been published 11 minutes ago, which meant it had been written before midnight, which meant whoever had written it had known what was happening in this hospital before midnight, which meant someone had been feeding information to this outlet the entire time, not reacting to tonight's events but anticipating them, preparing the counter-narrative while the events were still in progress. The Senate advisor, she said. Calloway was already reading over her shoulder. 48 hours is too long, she said. Calloway straightened, got on his phone, and Price looked at her with the expression of a journalist who understood exactly what this moment was not the end of the story, but the last thing that needed to be answered for the story could be told the right way. I'm publishing tonight, he said, with your name on it, with your statement full record. He paused. But I need you to go on camera, not just audio. The article they just published uses your name. The only way to counter that narrative is a face and a voice that people can see and hear giving a different account. She looked at the article headline on his screen. She thought about what on camera meant, about the 7 years of careful invisibility and the identity she'd built and the life she'd constructed, and all of it being permanently, irreversibly, over the moment she did what Price was describing. Then she thought about Daria Osei's dead-drop server sitting for 7 years waiting to be opened. She thought about 3 dead men whose families were still reading official death certificates that lied. She thought about Hector Dumas saying, I was just supposed to come in for my knee. Set it up, she said. Price was already reaching for his camera. And from the corner of the room, Merritt opened his eyes, not startled, just awake. The way he went from sleep to consciousness, with the abruptness of someone who'd trained himself never to be fully under, and looked at her and said, You sure? She looked at him. I was sure 7 years ago, she said. I just didn't have the right room yet. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Price positioned the camera. Calloway's people moved to the edges of the room to be out of the frame but didn't leave. Ethan put down his papers. And outside the conference room, in the hospital that was still processing the fact of what had happened, inside it, Nora heard the particular quiet of a building that had run out of normal night sounds and was waiting for something to happen. The camera's record light came on. She looked into it. And then her phone vibrated on the table beside her, a number she didn't recognize. A text message, 4 words only. We have the child. She read the message twice, 4 words. No name, no location. No demand articulated because none was needed. The demand was implicit in the message itself, in the timing of it, in the fact that whoever had sent it knew to send it to this number at this moment, which meant they'd been watching this room or listening to something connected to this room, which meant the situation she'd thought was resolving had one more layer she hadn't seen. Price's camera was still recording. The red light was still on. She turned the phone over on the table, screen down, and looked at Calloway. He'd seen her expression change. He was already crossing the room. She picked the phone up and handed it to him without a word. He read the screen. His jaw tightened once the same single controlled movement she'd made herself when she'd read it, and he stepped away and got on his radio in a voice too low to hear clearly. Merritt was watching her from his chair. The child you protected, he said quietly. Not a question. He'd heard enough over the past hours to understand the shape of what had just happened. Her name is Rin, Nora said. It was the first time she'd said the name aloud to anyone in this room, and it landed differently than she'd expected, heavier and more specific than an abstract reference, the name of a real person who was somewhere she didn't know right now. She was 6 when I found her at the installation site. She's 13 now. I've had her placed with a family in a city I'm not going to name until I know this room is completely secure. It's secure, Calloway said, coming back. I need you to be certain of that, she said. My team swept it 2 hours ago. He met her eyes. What can you tell me about her current location? She thought about the specific calculus of how much to say and to whom, a calculus she'd been running for 7 years with the same result. Say nothing. Tell no. Keep the circle closed, because the circle was the only thing that had kept Ren safe. But the circle had already been breached. Whoever had sent that message knew about Ren, which meant they'd known for some time, which meant the silence that had protected her was already compromised. I have a contact, she said. Someone who's been managing the placement. She's outside this investigation, outside this hospital, and I need to reach her in the next 10 minutes. Make the call, Calloway said. She dialed Delphine Marsh. Delphine picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd seen the news article that had published at 11:47 and understood what it meant and had been waiting. I saw it, Delphine said, before Nora could speak. Is she safe? Nora said. A pause that lasted 2 seconds and felt much longer. There were 2 men outside the house 40 minutes ago, Delphine said. They left when I called the local police. The family is fine. Ren is fine, but they were there, Evelyn. They were watching. Where are they now? I don't know. The police did a drive-by and they were gone. Another pause. I moved them an hour ago. Ren and the family, they're somewhere else. I'm not saying where on this line, I know, Nora said. Text the location to the secondary number, encrypted. Already written, Delphine said. Sending in 30 seconds a brief silence. Are you okay? It was the first time anyone had asked her that with the specific weight of someone who knew what okay meant, in context not physically functional, not professionally intact, but actually okay. In the way of a person carrying something that had been very heavy for a very long time. I will be, Nora said. She meant it. She wasn't certain it was true yet, but she meant it. Calloway had a federal protection unit at Ren's new location within 40 minutes. The men who'd been outside the original house were identified through local police security camera footage. 2 contractors with ties to a private security firm that Calloway's analyst connected, within 20 minutes of starting the search, to the same network that had supplied the team dispatched to Hargrove Memorial. The connection was documented, added to the evidence file, and transmitted to the Deputy IG's office as part of the expanding warrant package. The Senate advisor, his name was Aldrin Price. No relation to the journalist. A coincidence that Daniel Price noted with visible discomfort was detained at his residence at 1:14 in the morning. The detention was quiet, conducted by 2 federal marshals with a warrant that had been expedited by a federal judge who, Calloway told her, had been waiting for exactly this kind of case for 3 years, and moved on it with a speed that suggested the system was not entirely captured, even when it looked like it was. Nora heard about the detention through Calloway's radio at 1:22 a.m. While Price's camera was still recording and she was still talking, working through the section of her account that covered the valley, in specific detail the installation, the documentation, the ambush, the 4 days of extraction. She paused when Calloway signaled her, processed the information about Aldrin Price's detention, and then continued, because stopping in the middle of the valley section would mean coming back to it, and coming back to it would be harder than finishing it. She finished it. When she was done with that section, she stopped for 3 minutes, drank water, and looked at the table. Then she looked back at the camera and continued. She talked about Wren, not the location, not the family's names, not the specific details that could identify her, but the fact of her, the 6-year-old girl she'd found at the installation site in the valley, hiding behind an equipment housing with a thermal blanket over her head, the way children hide when they've learned that hiding is the thing that keeps you alive. She talked about the decision to take her out instead of leaving her with the extraction team, a decision she'd made in 40 seconds and had never second-guessed because some decisions were only complicated in retrospect, and this one had been clear. She talked about 7 years of managing Wren's placement from a distance, the encrypted communications, the carefully maintained separation that had kept them both safe until tonight. Price was very still while she talked about Wren. When she finished, he said, "How old is she now?" 13, Nora said. "Does she know about you?" Nora thought about that. About the letters she'd sent through Delphine never signed with a name, always in a handwriting she'd slightly altered, always with the specific detail of a person who was paying attention to Wren's life without being present in it. About whether a 13-year-old girl who had survived what Wren had survived at age 6, and who had grown up in a quiet house with people who cared for her well, understood that somewhere there was a woman who had carried her out of a valley and had never quite put her down. "She knows someone kept her safe," Nora said. "That's enough for now." Price's article published at 4:17 in the morning. She read it on Calloway's tablet, sitting in the conference room, that she'd been in for the better part of 10 hours, with gray pre-dawn light starting at the edges of the window, and Merritt asleep again in his chair, and Ethan Cole, somewhere down the hall on a phone call, with a family member who had apparently been calling every 30 minutes since midnight. The article was very good. It was the kind of journalism that was careful and furious at the same time, careful with the facts, meticulous about the documentation, sourced to the point of being nearly airtight, and underneath all of that precision a controlled fury at what the facts described that came through in the structure of the piece, rather than in any individual word. Price had been doing this long enough to know that rage worked best when it was implicit, when you let the events carry the emotional weight and trusted the reader to feel the appropriate thing. The counter-narrative article, the one published at 11:47 that had called her a rogue operative, had been up for 4 hours by the time Price's published. In those 4 hours, it had collected comments and shares, and the particular online momentum of a story that confirmed what some people already wanted to believe. Within 3 hours of Price's article going live, the counter-narrative piece had been retracted. Not quietly, the retraction notice cited the emergence of authenticated federal documentation that contradicted the article's central claims, and it was the kind of retraction that would follow the publication and the people behind it for a very long time. She read the retraction notice once and did not feel the satisfaction she'd half expected to feel. What she felt was closer to tired the deep. Specific tiredness of someone who'd been right about something terrible for a long time and had finally been publicly confirmed and found that confirmation was less triumphant and more exhausting than anticipated. That was fine. That was human. She'd learned to stop expecting herself to feel the convenient emotion at the convenient moment. The formal legal proceedings moved faster than anyone had predicted and more slowly than anyone had hoped, which was the characteristic pace of justice in the real world, as swift as the righteous wanted, nor as glacial as the guilty needed. Gerald Voss was indicted on 14 counts, including conspiracy to conduct unauthorized human experimentation, falsification of medical records, obstruction of a federal investigation, and accessory to the deaths of 3 patients whose names were now in the public record for the first time. He pled not guilty at his arraignment and hired a legal team that spent 6 weeks trying to negotiate the charges down and failed because the documentation was too complete and too corroborated for negotiation to find purchase. Lena Hart cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed testimony about the Tessis biomedical research structure, the chain of authorization for the hospital program, and the names of the corporate executives who had approved the human trials. Her cooperation was, Calloway told Nora later, the thing that accelerated the corporate indictments by approximately 4 months, because she knew where the internal documentation was stored and could authenticate it. Aldrin Price, the Senate advisor, the man whose name was in Daria Osi's original transmission as the command structure contact who'd authorized the ambush, was indicted on charges that included conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and abuse of his security clearance to surveil and compromise a federal investigation. He resigned from his advisory position 48 hours after his detention, before the indictment was formally filed, in what his office characterized as a decision to spend more time with his family, a statement that received the public response it deserved. Tessic Biomedical's research license was suspended within 10 days of the federal warrants being executed. Its corporate headquarters was sealed as an evidence site. The research program, the third iteration of something that had started in a valley 7 years ago, that had moved laterally and changed names, and kept running through 3 administrations and a dozen institutional protections, stopped. It stopped. That was the thing she had to keep returning to, in the weeks that followed, when the exhaustion made everything feel contingent and unresolved. The program had stopped. The people who ran it were in legal proceedings that would take years to complete and had already cost them everything they'd spent decades accumulating. The 3 patients who died at Hargrove Memorial had their deaths officially reclassified, their families notified, the fraudulent death certificates corrected in the public record. It wasn't clean. It wasn't a moment of catharsis, where the machinery of justice clicked into place like a key in a lock. Documents and hearings and retracted depositions and legal motions, and the grinding impersonal process of institutions correcting themselves under duress. But it was real, and real was what she'd been working toward, in one form or another, for 7 years. She saw Wren for the first time since the Valley, 3 months after the hospital. Delphine arranged it. In a park in a city, she wasn't going to put in any public record. On a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, when the trees were doing the tentative, uncertain thing they did before they committed to being fully green. The family that had raised Wren for the past 7 years, a couple named the Bramwells, steady and patient and private, who had known for all 7 years that this day was a possibility and had prepared Wren for it in the careful, honest way of people who understood that the truth was better than a comfortable fiction had brought her, then stepped away to a bench 50 yards distant, close enough to see, but far enough to make the space feel private. Wren was 13 and tall for her age, and had the particular bearing of a child who'd been through something very young and had organized herself around it without being broken by it. She looked at Nora with an expression that was complicated in the way of a person who'd been thinking about a moment for a long time, and was finding that the actual moment didn't match the imagined version, which was always true, and was never not disorienting. "I knew you were a woman," Wren said. "I didn't know what you looked like." "I look like this," Nora said, unhelpfully probably. "The letters didn't have a name," Wren said. "No. But I knew they were from the same person." She was studying Nora with the frank assessment of someone young enough not to have learned to hide their evaluations. "You always asked about my math. Nobody else cares about my math." "Math matters," Nora said. "That's what the letters said." A pause. "Are you going to be around now?" It was the most direct version of the question Nora had been asking herself for 3 months, and Wren had delivered it with the particular directness of someone who decided that if she was going to be disappointed, she wanted to know quickly rather than slowly. "I'm going to try," Nora said. "I'm not going to promise more than that, because promises in this direction have a history of being complicated." She held Wren's gaze. "What I can promise is that I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not disappearing, and I'm not sending letters through a third party anymore." Wren considered that for a moment. Then she said, "The Bramwells are good. I know I don't need replacing," Wren said. It was careful, protective of the people who'd raised her, and Nora felt a particular quality of not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that was about recognizing a person who'd grown into themselves well. "Nobody's being replaced," Nora said. "I'm just here." Wren nodded. It wasn't resolution. Exactly. It was a 13-year-old deciding to proceed on a provisional basis, which was the most honest possible response to a complicated situation, and Nora respected it entirely. They walked for 40 minutes. They talked about math, which Wren was genuinely good at, and about the Bramwell's dog, which was elderly and flatulent and apparently beloved, and about a school project on historical navigation systems that Wren had opinions about. They did not talk about the Valley. That conversation existed in the future, at a time and in a form that would need to be found carefully, and neither of them was ready for it yet. When they walked back toward the bench where the Bramwells were waiting, Wren said, without looking at her, I'm glad you didn't actually die. Me too, Nora said. Dax Merritt testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee in a closed session 5 months after the hospital. The session was classified, but a summary was released publicly, a 2-page document, precise and formal, that confirmed the existence of the Valley operation, confirmed the ambush, confirmed the command structure authorization for the ambush, and confirmed that Commander Merritt's testimony was consistent with the authenticated documentation obtained through the federal investigation. He called her afterward from a number that was actually his number this time. How'd it go, she asked. They were polite, he said. They had expressions like people watching a building they were responsible for on fire. Appropriate. One of them asked if there was anything the committee could do, personally, to acknowledge whatever the right word is. What did you say? I said. The people who needed acknowledging were the ones who didn't make it back, he said, and that what the committee could do was make sure that what happened in the Valley was formally entered into the record, not classified, not sealed on the record. Are they going to do it? They said yes. A pause. I'll believe it when I see it, but they said yes. She was sitting in the break room of a trauma unit in a different city, on a 12-hour shift that was 3 hours from ending, with a coffee she'd made 40 minutes ago and hadn't touched because something in the unit had gone sideways around the time she'd poured it, and she'd spent the interval sorting out the sideways. You sound, he said. I'm always tired, she said. That's not new. How's the new post? Harder than the last one, she said. Better. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to it. That tracks. There was a comfortable silence, the kind that existed between people who'd been through something together and didn't need to fill the air to prove the connection was intact. Daria's family, she said. Did you last month, he said. Her mother and her brother. I told them about the server, about what she did. He stopped for a moment. Her mother said she always did things twice. Always a backup. Said it was annoying when she was a kid. Another pause. She wasn't surprised her daughter had saved the world with a backup copy. Nora sat with that. Good, she said. The formal military record correction took 8 months to complete. 8 months of documentation review, identity verification, interdepartmental reconciliation between agencies that had, in some cases, processed her death declaration and needed to unprocess it, a task that the relevant bureaucracies approached with the particular institutional discomfort of organizations, being asked to acknowledge that their paperwork had been weaponized against one of their own. The correction was not ceremonial. There was no public event for the record change itself. It was an administrative action, processed in offices she never saw by people she never met, resulting in a series of documents that formally established that Evelyn Whitaker had not died in the Valley, that her service record was intact, that her rank and commendations were confirmed, and that the death declaration had been filed in error as the result of fraudulent intelligence. In error as the result of fraudulent intelligence was the specific language, and she'd read it 3 times when Calloway sent her the finalized documents, and she'd thought about all the things that language was doing and not doing, about the gap between what it said and what had actually happened, about the institutional preference for passive constructions, when the active version would require naming something as deliberate. She'd decided she could live with the gap. She'd lived with larger ones. Ethan Cole sent her a photograph the week the record correction was finalized. He was in an auditorium, at a podium, and behind him was a projection screen with the words medical ethics in institutional settings. When the system fails the patient, he'd attached one line to the photo. Thanks for teaching me what that actually looks like. Still figuring out the rest. She wrote back, that's the right pace. He responded with a thumbs up, and then, after a moment, a second message. Hector Dumas says hello. He had his knee fixed. Said it was a better outcome than expected. She smiled at her phone in the parking lot of the trauma unit where she was working in the gray light of a February afternoon, and felt something that was quiet and genuine and didn't need a larger name. The convictions, when they came, were not simultaneous. They arrived over 18 months, in the staggered, imperfect sequence of multiple parallel legal proceedings. Voss first, convicted on 11 of the 14 counts after a trial that lasted 6 weeks, and produced testimony from 17 witnesses, including Ethan, Hector Dumas, and the families of the 3 patients who died. The jury deliberated for 4 days. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon, and Calloway sent her a text that said only 11 counts, and she was in the middle of a shift, and she read it and put her phone back in her pocket and kept working, because the patient in Bay 3 needed her more than the verdict did right now, and the verdict would still be there when the shift ended. Hart received a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation, as agreed. 5 years with eligibility for supervised release. It was less than justice by most definitions. It was also what had unlocked the corporate indictments that ultimately brought down 6 senior Tessic biomedical executives on charges that carried mandatory minimums, so the arithmetic was complicated in ways that she'd made her peace with. Aldrin Price, the Senate advisor, the man in Daria Osi's transmission, the man whose phone calls had sent a contractor team to a hospital 27 minutes early, was convicted on all primary counts after a trial that lasted 9 weeks, and that produced, as its final witness, Commander Dax Merritt, who testified in his uniform for the first time since the Valley and described in specific procedural detail the ambush and its human cost, and the name of every person who had died in it. The sentencing for Aldrin Price was 22 years. She heard about it from Price the journalist, who sent her a link to his coverage with a note that said, "Not enough." Also the only thing that was ever going to happen. "Both things are true," she wrote back. "Yes, both things were always true." That was the thing she'd carried out of the Valley alongside as everything else. Not a lesson exactly, more an understanding. The way you understand something about the weight of water after you've nearly drowned in it. Justice was real, and it was also always partial. And live us inside that paradox without letting it hollow you out was the actual work. The work that didn't end when the verdict was read. The work that was just the permanent condition of being a person who'd seen what she'd seen and decided to keep going anyway. She decided to keep going. 14 months after the hospital, she was in a field trauma unit in a region she wasn't naming, supporting an international medical team running acute care for a population that had been without reliable medical infrastructure for 3 years. The work was brutal and exhausting, and occasionally it went wrong in ways she couldn't prevent, and occasionally it went right in ways that felt like the only thing that made sense. There was a moment, not the one she would have chosen for its significance, not a dramatic moment, just a Tuesday when she was reestablishing a patient's airway in a tent with inadequate lighting. And outside somewhere, ordnance was going off at irregular intervals, and the 2 other medical staff with her were a Ghanaian surgeon named Obina, who'd been doing this for 15 years, and a 24-year-old medic from Brazil named Clara, who was doing it for the first time and doing it well. Patient stabilized. Clara exhaled. Obina checked the airway and said without looking up, "Good positioning." "You got the angle," Clara said. "She showed me." Obina glanced at Nora. She was already checking the next patient. "She shows everyone," Obina said. "It's what she does." Later, Clara found her at the supply table, a real supply table, in an actual tent, with actual inventory that needed actual counting, which was either the universe's sense of humor or just the recurring texture of her life, and she decided it was both, and said, "I looked you up." Nora kept counting. "There's a lot of articles," Clara said. "There are," Nora said. "You were a soldier first." "Yes, and then you became a nurse." "Yes." Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, the irregular ordnance had stopped, which was either good news or the kind of quiet that preceded worse news, and both of them were calibrated to the distinction. "How do you know when to stop running?" Clara said. It wasn't really about Nora. It was the question of someone, early in the work, trying to find the framework that would let them survive it without losing themselves inside it. Nora set down her clipboard. "You don't stop running," she said. "You just change what you're running toward." She held Clara's gaze. "The running itself isn't the problem. It's whether you're going somewhere or just going." Clara looked at her with the expression of someone who was 24 and filing something away for a time when she'd understand it differently. "Okay," she said. "It takes time," Nora said. "Give yourself the time." The families of the soldiers who died in the Valley received their formal notifications from the Department of Defense in the same month that the Aldrin Price verdict came in. The notifications acknowledged that their loved ones had died in classified service, that the circumstances of their deaths had been suppressed, and that they were owed both the truth and the recognition that had been withheld from them. Nora wrote letters to each family. Not official letters. She had no official capacity, no institutional role, no authority to speak for anyone but herself. But she wrote them by hand, and she signed them with her actual name, and she told each family something specific and true about the person they'd lost, not generalities, not the anodyne language of official condolence, something she remembered, something specific that only someone who'd been there would know. She told one family about their daughter's habit of running diagnostic checks on equipment that was already verified, just to be sure. She told another family about their son's 3-word weather forecast system, bad, worse, Whitaker, which had been the unit's private joke about her tendency to keep moving regardless of conditions. She told Daria Osi's mother about the secondary encryption protocol and about the dead drop server and about the fact that Daria's caution and her paranoia and her absolute refusal to trust that things were fine had saved the entire investigation 7 years later. She told her your daughter was 26 years old, and she saved the world with a backup copy. The world doesn't know her name yet. It should. She didn't know if the letters helped. She knew they were true, and she knew that true things had a different weight than false ones, even when the weight felt the same. And she knew that the families deserved someone standing up and saying, I was there, and I remember. She had been there. She remembered. That was the thing she'd carried out of the valley that she hadn't expected to carry, not the trauma, not the guilt, not the specific texture of the fear she'd felt in those 4 days alone. Those things she'd expected, and they'd come, and she'd learned to hold them. What she hadn't expected was the memory, the specific, detailed, alive quality of her memory of every person in that unit, their habits and their voices in the particular way each of them had moved through spaces that were not safe, and the thing they'd each been trying to do, which was the same thing she was still trying to do, keep people alive. That was the whole job. That had always been the whole job. The uniform and the rank, and the classified designation, and the nursing badge, and the supply closet, and the valley, and the conference room, and the 10 in a region. She wasn't naming all of it, was just the changing context for the same persistent, stubborn, irreducible commitment. Keep people alive. Do it honestly. Do it even when the people with authority over you would rather you didn't. Do it even when the cost is something you weren't prepared to pay. Do it even when you have to become someone else to keep doing it, and then do the harder thing, which is become yourself again when the time comes. She was 40 years old. She was a nurse. She was Evelyn Whitaker, on the record now. The death declaration overturned, the service history restored, the name her own again in every document that mattered. She was also, in ways she was still finding the edges of the person she'd been becoming in the 7 years of being someone else, the particular patience she'd learned, the specific knowledge of how institutions worked from below rather than from above, the understanding that quiet persistence outlasted dramatic confrontation more often than not, and that the people who underestimated you were only ever telling you something about themselves. She didn't have a plan beyond the next deployment, the next rotation, the next patient in the next tent in the next region where the medical infrastructure had failed and people needed someone to show up. She had Ren, who was 14 now, and had recently sent her a photo of a math competition trophy with a caption that said "Only told you," and which Nora had put on the shelf above her bunk in the field unit where everyone could see it. She had Merritt, who called every few weeks from whatever assignment he was currently not talking about, and whose voice on the phone was the voice of someone who'd also found a way to keep going. She had Ethan's sporadic updates from wherever he was teaching, and Calloway's occasional professional communications that contained, sometimes, a line at the end that was personal rather than procedural. She had Delphine, who was, officially, a retired public defender in Tucson, and who would remain so, and who sent her books through a forwarding address, because she'd noticed, 7 years ago, that Nora read when she could and had never stopped to sending. She had the work. She had the memory of everyone who'd paid a cost so that the truth could exist in the public record, and the obligation that came with that memory, which wasn't guilt and wasn't debt, but was something more like purpose, the specific, directed purpose of a person who understood exactly what they were doing and why, and who was not going to stop. She had been dismissed and disbelieved and reassigned to count gauze pads and declared dead and erased from the record, and she had come back through every one of those things, not because she was extraordinary, in the way that stories sometimes made people extraordinary, but because she was ordinary in the most important sense, stubborn and imperfect and tired and occasionally wrong and absolutely, implacably unwilling to let the wrong version of the story be the one that stood. In the tent, with the irregular ordnance quiet now, and Obina reviewing the next intake, and Clara checking inventory, with the focused attention of someone learning to be careful, Nora Whitaker picked up her clipboard. She started counting. She was very good at it. And this time she knew exactly what she was counting toward.